and thank you for coming today. Well, it is a great pleasure to be invited to give the Popper Seminar here, which is where I started some time ago. So I'm going to start by thanking my colleagues here from LSE Philosophy, and especially Brian Roberts, for this kind invitation. So I thought before I give you the outline of my talk today, I thought I'd say a few words about the motivation for writing this paper, which is called Co-Cognition and Social Discourse. And also I'll say a few words about where the paper sits in philosophy, because I think it sits at the interplay of different disciplines. Just to start, my paper is actually a reaction paper to another article published by Jane Hill, I'm sure you know, influential philosopher of mind based in Cambridge. That article came out in Mind a few years ago, in 2013. And as you can see, co-cognition features in the title. It's actually co-cognitivism, the view that follows from co-cognition. And I'm going to spend some time on that concept. So first of all, why a reaction paper? Well, in that article, Jane Hill provides a brilliant account, I think, of the nature of psychological knowledge. And she does it by drawing on considerations about what philosophers of social science typically call shared or collective intentionality. And that is the thing that really captured my attention. I'm going to spend some time, the first part of the talk, defining the critical concepts. There is a lot of jargon here, so just bear with me for a few minutes and then I'll get there. In general, many of the things that she says in this paper I'm very sympathetic with, I have to say, and you'll see why just in a few minutes. But of course, I guess we express our admiration by criticizing people, especially philosophers. So the point is that there is one thing that she said and I don't quite like, hence my reaction. That is my motivation for writing this paper about co-cognition. So here's the plan of what I'm going to do. Okay, so first of all, it looks a bit funny. Anyway, so first of all I'm going to define psychological knowledge. This is a general label, so for the sake of consistency, I will stick to what Jane Hill presents as psychological knowledge in the context of what she calls the received or mainstream view of social cognition. That's the target of her paper, not my paper. Then, in fact, she puts forward an alternative that she calls co-cognitivism from co-cognition. So the first part is really a reconstruction of what she says, and it's something that I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to say what she thinks because I am sympathetic with her approach, and it's again about co-cognition. Then I'm going to zoom in on my target, which is something she says about co-cognitivism, the conclusion that she draws from that view, and that will become the target of my presentation in the second part. So in the second part I'm going to criticize her point, and my argument will come in two forms. One is a negative point that I want to make against her conclusion, and I will use an example from research on social cognition, empirical research. And then I'd like to try to make a positive, though speculative point, so it's still work in progress, in the last bit, point 4, in the last bit of my presentation. And that is where, in a way, I put forward my own view of what's going on with co-cognition. I look forward to some reaction from you. All right, so first of all, the first step is what do we mean by psychological knowledge here? I'm going to do a bit of stage setting, and before I do that, as I said, I will stick to Hill's language. What I'm going to present, she takes to be the mainstream or received view in social cognition. For those of you who are familiar with this field of research, you may be a bit puzzled, as I was, because, well, to be fair, the paper came out in 2013. What we've seen in social cognition is a bit like a paradigm shift. in the sense that that mainstream, so-called mainstream view, may no longer be actually the received view in social cognition, but that's not really important for my argument. I just wanted to give you a bit of a warning here. All right, so there is something, I'm going to define psychological knowledge. Well, she says, what is psychological knowledge? Suppose that I have a thought in my mind, a thought pops up in my mind. Now, I asked Richard, since we're talking about psychological knowledge and social cognition, to be my partner. Now, Richard is down today with flu, so he's not here. Well, Alex, may I suggest? All right, so a thought pops up in my mind. It's why psychological knowledge? Well, suppose that I have a thought based on, I see Alex moving, and I think at some point that Alex believes that this is a philosophy of mind paper. Okay? Now, what defines my thought as psychological is the fact that I come to have a thought, come to think about Alex's mind as having a certain belief. Okay? So this is what, very simply, she calls psychological knowledge. Now, two specifications here. Knowledge is used in a very kind of ordinary language way, so there is no specific philosophical meaning attached to knowledge. Okay? Second, why a thought? You might want to ask, well, why not a belief by self, or a desire, or an intention, or an emotion? Well, for no particular reason. I just don't want to bias my presentation towards a certain mental state. So I'm going to pick thoughts, the way in which, for instance, Tim Crane talks about intentional mental states as mental states that represent things in the world. Okay? So now, why psychological? Because it's a thought about the mind of another person. So according to Hill, psychological knowledge is knowledge of other minds. What is an example of non-psychological knowledge? Well, suppose that I have a thought pops up in my mind about the LSE library in front of me, or the Lakatosh building. This is not a thought about another mind. It's a thought about what she calls an inanimate thing, an inanimate object, or event, or state of affairs. Okay, so that's basically the distinction that she makes at the beginning. Now, suppose that I ascribe, this is what we do in social cognition, I attribute a belief to Alex. It's the content of the belief is that, well, this is a philosophy of mind paper. It's quite an abstract thought. It could have whatever practical content you want. It doesn't really matter. Okay? It's a thought with some content. Now, a crucial question, as you probably know, in the philosophy of mind, and especially in social cognition, is as follows. What makes it the case? What are the conditions of satisfaction of my thought that Alex believes that this is the case? So what makes it true of my thought that Alex believes that this is a philosophy of mind paper? This is a crucial, perhaps the most important question in the philosophy of mind for those maybe interested in social cognition. Now, the so-called received view of social cognition provides an answer exactly to this question. And the answer is, again, something that we might be familiar with. So, according to the received view, this is how Hill represents it, I have a thought, I ascribe a belief to Alex with a view to explaining, predicting, possibly controlling his behavior. So the function of psychological knowledge is explanation and prediction. And why is it? Well, think about it. If I have a thought, if I ascribe a belief to Alex or an intention, I do it because at the end of the day what I want to do is to explain, to be ready even to anticipate his behavior. I'm interested in what Alex will do next. So according to the received view, explanation and prediction is really what psychological knowledge is for. Just to give you an example and make the idea a bit more vivid, usually supporters, advocates of the received view Think of science and scientific explanation as basically what we are doing when we ascribe mental states to another person. So if you think about scientific practice, well, explanation and prediction, social cognition works pretty much the same way. I ascribe beliefs, we ascribe all sorts of mental states to other people because we want to explain their behavior. This view is called theory, okay? To emphasize, it's not a mistake, to emphasize the theoretical, scientific-like nature of social cognition. Now, this is, I'm going to use a couple of quotes from Hill, from the paper. This is a passage where she, I think, beautifully captures the rationale of theory. And so she says that to think of a thing as having psychological characteristics is to think of it as falling under some theory, the merit of which is that it enables prediction and hence explanation and sometimes control of human thought and action. The more detailed, the better. That's really sort of, you know, the core idea of theory. Now, she doesn't like this. This is the target of her paper. Why? Well, suppose that you instead like the idea that explanation and prediction at the end of the day is what we do when we ascribe mental states to other people. Now, the question, you remember, back to the question that I posed before, what are the conditions of satisfaction of my thought that Alex believes that something is the case? Well, the theory approach seems to underlie a particular view of the nature of psychological knowledge. And again, let me draw your attention to this because that's her target. What is this view? Well, I try to I'll use an example and I'll try to reconstruct her reasoning. The reasoning is as follows. If I ascribe a belief to Alex with a view to explaining his behavior, in a way, I'm kind of tacitly assuming, I'm operating on the assumption that there must be some kind of structure, causal structure behind Alex's behavior that instantiates the belief, shapes his action, okay? So if you think about mental processes as information processes, and that's a very traditional way to think about the mind, the kind of information that I'm really after is information about that structure. There must be an internal state in Alex's mind, if not brain, that kind of brings about that belief. Now, what Hill says here is that if you are an advocate of the theory approach, if you believe that psychological knowledge is for explanation and prediction, then you are basically an internalist. And by internalist in philosophy of mind, I mean an individualist. So back to the question, you must be assuming implicitly that there is a state, a psychophysical state, psychological and neurophysical, that the person, Alex, must be in for me to have the thought that I have. And this is typically an internalist account, an internalist approach to social cognition. Now, she doesn't like this, and clearly this is her target. It's not my target, but again, for the sake of consistency, I thought I'll start from here. Now, she then puts forward an alternative, and that's called co-cognitivism, and that's where my picture, in a way, my view comes in. Now, what is co-cognitivism? Suppose that you don't like the idea that psychological knowledge is for explanation and prediction. That's not the function of psychological knowledge. Well, you may want to say, I'll stick to this for a few minutes. You might want to say, well, it's not very realistic. Why? Well, she says, for a number of reasons. When we ascribe mental states to other people, perhaps it's true that we want to explain, predict, control their behavior, but that's not realistic. Why is it that we ascribe mental states to other people? Well, she says, for a simple reason, because we want to do things with other people. So she says, our goal, the function of psychological knowledge, is actually to be able to engage with other people in what she calls co-cognitive, shared cognitive activities. And we do that for a number of reasons. Now, to give you an idea, I guess to make the idea a bit more vivid, in ordinary language we often say, put our heads together, join forces. She says, pooling mental resources together. That is what she takes as the function of psychological knowledge. And she calls that co-cognition. So here is another interesting passage where she says, so when I try to establish at the start of a discussion what attitudes you have and to what contents, my aim is not to use that information to predict or control in detail what you will then think and say, but rather to put myself in a position to understand and rightly develop what you offer, so that we together can come to some interesting or sensible plan of action. So that's really the rationale of her view, and it's an alternative view to theory. Now, again, the idea, sorry if you see Richard, but that was, the plan was different. So what view, if co-cognitivist is true, if you think that the function of psychological knowledge is not explanation and prediction, but is the ability to engage in interaction with others, so what view of the nature of psychological knowledge does co-cognitivist presuppose? Well, an alternative view. And here again, the reasoning that she makes is as follows. Suppose that, once again, bear with me, I ascribe a belief to Alex that something is the case, and I do it with a view to engaging with Alex in some kind of shared activity. I'm not really interested to explain Alex's behavior. I just want to do something with him, all sorts of social activities. Okay, then what am I tacitly assuming then? Well, she says, I am assuming, I'm operating on the assumption that Alex and I share something, of course, for us to be able to kind of put our heads together and typically co-cognize. And why is that the case? Well, she says for a number of reasons. First of all, because there are many things in real life that we cannot accomplish alone, on our own. So we need someone else. She also gives a long list of evolutionary considerations. So it may well be the case that human mind has evolved as a social mind, precisely because the ultimate goal was to engage in shared activities like co-cognition. Or, well, she says, simply because we take pleasure out of social interaction. We don't have to have an interest or some kind of plan of action. We just do it because of the pleasure that we take out of it. So what is the view of the nature of psychological knowledge? Well, she says, if what we take for granted is that there is something shared between us, she claims the best candidate is typically culture. That is the mixture, the combination of social linguistic practices, conventions, social norms that govern behavior in our community. Now, this response is a very popular one in the philosophy of social science. It goes back to people like Peter Winch, if not the late Wittgenstein, if not before. And it's a perfectly legitimate answer. Now, this is my target. This is what I tend to resist. Even if I claim you support, as I do, co-cognitivism as a view of the function of psychological knowledge, that does not imply the kind of conclusion that she draws. And what is the conclusion? Well, the conclusion is precisely that if you like co-cognitivism, you are a social anti-individualist, a social externalist of some kind. And that's the opposite, the alternative view to the view of the nature of psychological knowledge that comes out of the theory approach. So you see the picture now. She has a target, the mainstream view of psychological knowledge, because that implies an internalist, an individualist view of social cognition. The alternative is co-cognitivism. Why? Because that implies, she says, an externalist, an anti-individualist view. This is the very bit that I don't quite like. So far all the things I've said, especially things about co-cognitivism, I'm very sympathetic with. And I have to say that in my own work on social cognition, with Chris Frith, who's here with us today, well, we did try to advocate a view of social cognition that is close in spirit to co-cognitivism. The bit that I do not like is the conclusion that she draws from that. That is, let me put it in a slogan, if you are a co-cognitivist, then you must be a social externalist, a social anti-individualist. What do I mean by social anti-individualism here? Well, she typically has in mind Tyler Burge's version of anti-individualism. So you know that philosophy of mind, especially externalism, comes in many different flavors. Nowadays, there is a lot of talk, a lot of debate around the so-called 4E cognition. That is extended, embedded, embodied, and inactive. And that's called active externalism. She is not concerned with active externalism. What she has in mind is the kind of so-called passive, classical, traditional externalism in philosophy that goes back to Putnam, the Twin Earth thought experiment, and also in particular Burge. That's called social anti-individualism. So it's the idea that our psychological dispositions depend constitutively on the social environment. That's why it's called social. And it's a strong claim, it's a very strong claim. It's an ontological and it's an epistemological claim. So ontologically, it means that I couldn't have the psychological knowledge that I have if I were not in that particular social environment. I couldn't actually ascribe the belief that I ascribe to Alex if I was not in this particular social environment. So the conditions of satisfaction of my thought about Alex, my psychological knowledge, depend constitutively on these social circumstances. And then it's an epistemic claim. It means that I cannot fully explain my thought in abstraction from the social environment. Now, this claim I'm going to resist in a way, and that's exactly the target of my reaction paper. I'm all for co-cognitivist. I'm not in support of the conclusion that she draws. And my argument, now comes my argument. Before I do that, I just wanted to kind of anticipate a possible objection or question, and I think this is important to say before I set up my reaction to Hill. You might want to say, okay, now we know your agenda. You are an individualist, so you are rejecting Hill's conclusion, because at the end of the day you are advocating some version of individualism. Yes and no. Why? Well, first of all, because I don't think my reaction to Hill, I don't think that I felt urged to react to Hill because I wanted to defend individualism. That's not ultimately my goal, in a way. Also, I believe that if we look at current research on social cognition, I don't think that individualism provides the best framework for understanding what is going on. So if we think about, if we use individualism as a tool, as an explanatory resource, I don't think that helps us to understand the best of social cognition nowadays. Perhaps it was in the past, but not now. That's another paper. I said yes and no, well, because what I'm really interested in at the end of the day, and that's where I think my motivation lies, is that I'm interested in individual differences. Well, I should clarify what I mean by this, because I think the importance of the concept wasn't clear to me until I started to work as a psychologist. Why is that? Because I think that for people trained in the philosophy of mind, individual differences is not really one of the top concepts in our kind of philosophical vocabulary. So what do I mean by this? I'm going to make an example to make things a little more vivid. There are many starting points in the literature on shared or collective intentionality. Typically, one starting point is the idea, the claim, that when individuals think about two people lifting a table together or painting a house together, these are quintessential examples of shared intentionality. Okay, so when two people join forces and do things together, the fact that they become a group, even only two people, changes group membership, shapes, changes their mind, their action. Now, there is a tendency in the philosophy of social science to observe this and shift your attention from the individual to the group. Okay? Whenever group membership becomes evident, you tend to focus on the group, and there are, so many interesting questions about group agency, group mind, group mentality, and so on, and group behavior, and so on and so forth. This is a tendency that you can see not just in the work of the usual suspects in social ontology nowadays, but if we go back to Durkheim, to the classics, I think the tendency is already there. Now, what I mean by individual differences is that I'm interested in how the mind of the individual gets changed, transformed through the process of group formation. And when the group becomes some kind of entity, we don't know exactly what kind of entity, but becomes that thing, I still keep focused, keep my mind focused on the individual. So I really follow the individual all the way through, even during the process of group formation. And that is what I believe makes me more interested in individual differences, and it may come across as, in a way, supporting an individualistic agenda, which is really not my ultimate goal. So, having said that, so I'm interested in that guy over there, or her, that stands out when some kind of group becomes formed. Alright, so, what I'm going to do now is to try to reject Hill's conclusion that if you are a co-cognitivist, as I am, then you must be an externalist, that you must be some kind of social anti-individualist. As I said before, I'm going to do it in 2 steps. First of all, I have a negative point against her conclusion, and then a positive kind of point. So, my negative point is this. I'm going to go back to something I said at the beginning, when I made a distinction between psychological and non-psychological knowledge. According to her, psychological knowledge is knowledge about other minds. My thought that Alex has a certain belief. Non-psychological knowledge is knowledge about inanimate things. My thought that there is the LSE library. This is the Lakatos building. Now, she draws this distinction quite sharply, and I'm going to criticize this distinction. I don't think that there is such a sharp, clear-cut distinction between what we call psychological and non-psychological knowledge. Why did she do it in the first instance? Well, because she claims that the function of psychological knowledge is typically to engage in some shared cognitive activity, co-cognition. While when we look at non-psychological knowledge, it may well be the case that we have the thoughts that we do at any given time about non-psychological entities, because we are interested in explaining the causal structure, what's going on behind that phenomenon. Now, I'm being a bit simplistic, but the example of scientific practice really works here. We all have this kind of romantic view of scientists that, they try to explain natural phenomena, and what they are actually doing is to uncover some kind of structure that they want to shed light on. Now, the image is the same here. So what she thinks people take the theory approach, individual, the internalist approach to do, is actually to try to uncover some structure in the mind, some cognitive structure. So she says, no, that's not the case. That's not the case for psychological knowledge. And so she draws this distinction. As I said, I'm going to criticize the distinction because I don't think that if there is any line to be drawn, it's that sharp. First of all, the reason is that co-cognition may well be a mechanism of cognition in general, not just social cognition. And this is where my example, my illustration, hopefully will help. So the fact that we want to engage in shared cognitive activities may be an important factor, not just in fixing the conditions of satisfaction of my thoughts about other people, but also in fixing the conditions of satisfaction of my mental states about whatever state or object or event in the world, even a non-psychological event. On the other side, I'm not happy to give up on the idea that no explanation and no prediction are involved in psychological knowledge. I may well have the thoughts that I do with regard to other people because I'm also interested in explaining their behavior. So it's perfectly rational and reasonable to say that I want to engage in some activity with them, but I also want to explain their behavior. So what I'm doing now is to make the distinction a bit more problematic than it is in that paper. The example that I have here is something that I'm sure you are familiar with, and this is a psychological phenomenon called joint attention. I chose this one because I think it's one of the most prolific and successful and interesting research programs at the interplay of philosophy and psychology, perhaps for the last 20 years, if not more. So there are philosophical definitions of joint attention. I'm going to give you a definition from the psychological point of view, and especially from the perspective of the work of a psychologist called Michael Tomasello, who did with his collaborators a lot of work on joint attention. Now, joint attention is a phenomenon of typically developmental psychology, and here's what you have. Joint attention is called a triadic interaction. So think about a triangle where the nodes are typically a child, very young, about 1 year of life, if not before, the mother, so a caregiver, and then you have an external object, typically what Hill would call an inanimate object, whatever object you want. The interaction is very simple. The mother wants to draw the child's attention to a salient, an aspect, specific aspect of the object. Now the story goes like this. In the first months of life, what you see is a lot of face-to-face interaction between the child and the mother, but it's all a dyadic interaction. So the child either looks at the mother or at the object. There is no triangulation, Davidson would say here. Now, at some point, and this is still controversial, I believe, I asked the help of my colleagues from psychology here, at some point around, according to Tomasello, 9 to 12 months of age, for the first time you see the child engaging with both the mother and the object. So the interaction becomes fully triadic. There is a lot of debate here. Why? Well, because we're talking about a pre-linguistic interaction, and also it's called a pre-conceptual. There is not much conceptual going on there. Yet, the child seems to understand what's going on. And in fact, for the first time, the child grasps, in a way, the aspect that the mother wanted him or her to pay attention to. There is some intentional understanding. I leave this on the table for discussion. It's still a controversial point. The reason why I wanted to bring this up as an example is that in this particular case, we observe a shared cognitive activity. Tomasello calls this the 9-month cognitive revolution, social cognitive revolution in developmental psychology. So we see a shared cognitive, a co-cognitive activity where actually some reference is established for the first time in the mind of the child. And it's reference to an inanimate object. So here you see that there is no real distinction to be made, or at least it's very thin, between psychological and non-psychological knowledge. And it's also a good example of of the fact that co-cognitive activities play a role in the cognitive development of phenomena like reference in our mind. So once again, this is done to problematize Hill's point that we can draw a distinction between psychological and non-psychological phenomena. My last point is some kind of positive, speculative argument that I like to give as an alternative to her conclusion. And this is something that I've been working on for a while. It's part of a broader project to articulate a theory of shared intentionality based on individual differences. So back to what I said before, here the key explanatory unit is still the individual, but I take interaction and group membership very seriously into account. So to focus on the individual is not to forget the social group stuff, and not at all. It's just to keep some emphasis on the individual, and this is my kind of third way approach to shared intentionality. So I'm going to tell this story here. I'm going to go back to the reasoning that I made before in my example. So suppose that I ascribe a belief to Alex, because I want to do something with it. So that's my ultimate goal. Jane Hill says, well, if you do that, then you are tacitly assuming that Alex and you, Mattia, share something, and that must be a shared convention, norm, rule of behavior, whatever. There, I said before, is exactly where I, in a way, disagree, and my philosophical leanings take me in a different direction from the Peter Winch, Wittgenstein direction. Why? I have a different intuition, in the sense that if I ascribe a belief to Alex with a view to engaging in some activity with him, what I am assuming is that, well, I can achieve more than I could do if I were just on my own. And this is not, I'm not just referring to those tasks that we can only accomplish together, say lifting a table together. No, in general, I'm referring to any social interaction. We could just achieve more if we pool our mental resources together. So my point is that co-cognition is vital, is fundamental for, as a mechanism of cognition in general, because it opens up new ways of seeing things in the world for each individual, new options for action. And this is the sense in which, say, for instance, people working on collective intelligence nowadays in AI, which is a very trendy topic, they use the word augmentative. When we put our heads together, this very fact has an augmentative, expansive effect on our each individual minds. So in a way we have each individually, Alex and I have access to new options for action. The space of mental activity gets expanded by the fact that we do some co-cognition, some thinking together. Here comes my last example. What do I mean by saying that if we pool our mental resources together, then we each individually have access to new understandings? Well, again, if we look at what's going on now in empirical research on social cognition, I said before there seems to be a paradigm shift in the way in which we explain social cognition. Well, for those of you who are familiar with it, for a long time in empirical research, scientists used a standard paradigm where, I'm telling a story here, where there was a subject, the subject whose social skills were being tested. And this subject usually was, by and large, he or she was instructed to perform a task that involved some social information. But typically, the standard paradigm was that you have a subject sitting in front of a computer being asked to perform a task in a cubicle. So there was no real-time interaction with another subject until some people, and especially Chris Frith, noticed, well, you know, we are studying social cognition, so better to have at least two people interacting and we see what's going on. And this is what happened a few years ago in social cognition when scientists started to consider the role of interaction more seriously and to factor it in the design of experiments. And the consequence is that now there is a massive amount of empirical evidence showing that when two people interact in real time directly, they each individually exhibit patterns of behavior that they wouldn't exhibit if they were acting alone, or even if they were observing someone else interacting with another person. So you have to have, when you are involved in real-time interaction, that in a way sort of triggers some psychological dispositions that probably are just not manifested when we act on our own. And that's the idea of augmenting, expanding the repertoire of options for action that we have through co-cognition, through the sharing of mental resources. I've been working on this, and in a way it's still a bit speculative. It's the last bit of my paper, but I'm happy to, in a way, to receive some feedback. So I'm going to conclude by making 3 points here that I hope sort of summarize my message. Well, first of all, I think that co-cognitivism is a great idea in social cognition. Well, because co-cognition has a broader scope than Hill would be able or willing to accept. I think it's a mechanism of cognition, not just social cognition. But I also think that if you endorse co-cognitivism, you're not necessarily a social anti-individualist. I'm not saying that you are not. You can be, of course, but it's not what primarily is recommended as a view of the nature of psychological knowledge. And of course, you don't have to be an individualist either. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm just saying that if you keep focused on how the individual gets transformed in the course of interaction, you may well come up with a different theoretical conclusion than just a social anti-individualism. All right, thanks.